decisive examples of what leadership can do for the continent in driving us towards a more perfect union. In order for us to get there, the movement of goods and services has got to be easy. And it would obviously bring us to points where technology is the biggest driver of efficiency. It is the biggest driver of accountability and transparency, something that is really lacking a lot in trade. We have this distinguished panel, starting with Mr. Gunther, Chris, Alex, Marco, and Richard. Welcome. And I believe we have the tough task that will hopefully give us some how-tos of how we free trade area into reality through digital trade. So I'll start with Richard, who I think has one of the toughest jobs in the room. Collecting revenues for government to fund our development is not easy. And so, Richard, I want to ask, what are you that is helping, that you think will have an impact on how we do business, not just in Rwanda, but generally across the continent? What tax trade and collections in that regard?
Thank you, Lucy. Well, you did mention that it is a difficult job, but I think I'm serving in an opportune time where technology has taken its toll in terms of creating visibility of what is happening, at least in the global supply chain. And I always ask myself how the commissioner generals who served the tax authorities back then, when technology was not really doing what is doing today as a key enabler, how they used to manage. So I think if you look at what is happening on the global scale, globalization is happening, trade flows are happening, and there is visibility enabled by technology. What we are trying to do in terms of having visibility as tax authorities, I think globally there has been an acknowledgement that there is an imbalance that is caused by lack of visibility in economic activities. And under the OECD, back then in 2015, what we call base erosion and profit shifting, they call it BEPS, and it came up with about 15 action agendas. And the action number one is taxation in the digital. So the global scale is acknowledging that there is a challenge for the taxman to know what is happening with the digital trade. And we've come up with measures on how to ensure that we can improve and have visibility. So Africa has joined that cause under the African Tax Administration Forum of members. We are embracing that drive to see how we can improve visibility of economic transactions. But that is on international scale. Again, on international scale, we're trying to see how we can join the global forum on automatic exchange of information. Now, there is getting information as a member, but there is another challenge of using the information. Economies to leverage on the information we are getting, to use it for risk profiling purposes to ensure that taxation is collected, tax is collected where it is due. So we are coming up with solutions, risk engines that can inform us on how we can tax efficiently, but also domestically we've come up with solutions like electronic fiscal. I'll try to talk for Rwanda this time around. At least you can try to track up to 3 levels of the supply chain. So that is giving you visibility. However, we do have challenges in terms of business to consumer. the visibility gets minimal as you move down the chain. But we have plans also to get to that level of the business to consumer.
I'll come back to you on the business to consumer because obviously Africa's economy is mostly informal. And so I would like Marco, welcome to Rwanda. You are in the education space and do a lot of research. As you give your opening statement, intra-Africa trade is the lowest in the world, about 18%, at least according to the World Economic Forum. Whereas other regions like Europe and Asia and North America are doing research that you've done. If you could please talk about some of the areas where Africa, for instance, if there is one thing that we can focus on in the next year, what would that be that would elevate us closer to that intra-regional trade that we're looking for?
First of all, thank you for invitation to take part in this panel discussion. It's a pleasure. And I'd say, yes, it's true that Africa has the lowest rates. Not consider that fact as a negative one, for two reasons. Reason first, 2018.
Yes.
So March 21st, 2018 might become a historical date for Africa. It does not necessarily mean it will become. It depends upon all African countries and the commitment of the countries. However, it gives very good prerequisites, preconditions to make Africa to open up more. For example, rate of inter-African, you rightly said, approximately 30%, up to 30%. Just for comparison, Europe is doing 70%. But there is one very important point. When you take a look into legislation of European Union countries, you will understand that legislations and systems of the countries are very well harmonized. So the keyword number one for the success is harmonization. They have harmonized customs policy, avoiding double taxation policies, of goods, services, people policies. Even many things regarding monetary and fiscal policy are also harmonized. Legislative regulations about, for example, very simple thing, when you're trading, I don't know, fruits or milk. For milk, let's take example. If you are trading milk, they have harmonized level of aflatoxin in milk. So there is maximum rate, which is applicable for all European Union countries. And then any single producer who wants to deal with goods or services knows what are the standards he has to comply to if he wants to penetrate wider European, let's say, EU market. But EU market is not only EU market, it includes also the accession countries, the countries which are now harmonizing their legislation and aligning it with the European Union in order to be able to access EU within the couple of years. So I'd say March 21st, 2018 gave a historical chance. And from the second point, it also gave an opportunity for Africa to realize, understand, and utilize the potential. I hope in the future discussion now during this panel, we will discuss a bit more about where we have emphasized actually a couple of measures which can lead to utilizing potential of Africa when it comes to inter-African countries trade. But from our point of view, this is a significant thing, and let's see how we can leverage on it all together. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe harmonization will remove a lot of headaches for most of us because, the CEO of EcoBank mentioned, we do work in 36 countries, and so trying to innovate for various regulations is obviously difficult and makes such opportunities perfect. Alex, you are the investment manager for Africa at DMM, and Richard mentioned how B2C is still a challenge, and that's where most of Africans trade today. What are some of the things that you're doing, innovating around to simplify trade, particularly B2C or any other area for the country?
Thank you, Lucy. Good afternoon, everyone. So maybe just to give a background about DMM. DMM.com is a Japanese company, and from 2016, we set up a fund, DMM Africa, of which myself and a few others are in charge of, to invest in African startups, in African businesses. Japan is an e-commerce platform first and foremost, has other digital products, but we wanted to bring a similar technology or to invest in similar businesses across the continent. Now, the Japanese people, it's huge. Obviously, coming to Africa, we are hoping to have a big market rather than just a single country. And actually, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has come at an opportune time for us, because now, instead of just Rwanda, we can do business in multiple countries, but by just having a headquarters, say, here in DMM Hehe, which is an e-commerce platform, and I would say that what we are doing is trying to, we like to call it I-commerce, intelligent commerce. So you have a lot of these SMEs who do business, for their neighborhoods, but sometimes you might go and buy something there and they don't have it. So that intelligence to know, what is needed at what time, by using digital platforms, obviously we can monitor how they are selling, and we can tell them that this is what you need to stock up, for this particular season or for these particular days. Just that we provide a bigger market for these guys. So, Africa, I think most trade is done by word of mouth, but by having an online platform, you access people who don't necessarily know you personally. So those are a couple of things, and the other thing is logistics. We are helping, these small SMEs, instead of having to transport these things themselves on a motor, or we provide that platform. And why that is important is because by us gathering, these goods from different sectors, we can put them together and send them to, to different areas cheaply than if they were to do it themselves. So by digitizing them, bringing them in our platform, we help them sort of optimize their services. We help them, reach a wider market and be able to supply people who are not necessarily in their neighborhoods.
Thank you. So logistics seems to be the biggest challenge for SMEs, all right? So we'll come back to that later to hear more, some more on that. Chris, you are the CEO of Countable. An interesting, I think what you do is interesting in terms of using social clout, so to speak, to know more about the people you work with. And you're doing work in Rwanda and Kenya. We would like to know what you're learning so far about trade in Africa.
Sure. So I think, so Countable, as you mentioned, and we have offices in San Francisco, Cayman, Mauritius, Nairobi, and Kigali. And I think the most important thing to learn to leverage is this idea of harmonization, but as it applies to the SME trader. So, there's a huge amount for our customers and our platform by the free trade zone. But one of the things that we measure and have learned to leverage are the sets of behaviors that quality traders exhibit regardless of what market they're in. So whether you're, exporting goods from Nairobi or importing goods from France or India or Turkey into East Africa, there are a set of behaviors that traders exhibit that look very, very much the same. So it's an interesting merger, I guess, of harmonizing the human behaviors and then all of the frictions that they have to go through, and how those two things are coming together as we make things easier through these kinds of improvements.
Thank you. Gunther, Europe, as Marco mentioned and we mentioned, has the highest percentage of intra-regional trade, at least according to the stats. Germany in particular is one of the most successful, I think, in Europe in terms of coming from a difficult past and building to becoming among the top economies in the world. It makes me believe that in addition to so many other things, that Africa has the same potential. What do you think will make this AfCFTA work for Africa? There's something that you're doing, I think, that is interesting to create opportunities on the continent to reduce the influence into Europe. Is it working? And just what can we learn that we can be able to utilize to achieve success?
Yeah, one of the most important things, but first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation, and it's the first time, and Transform Africa is very important from my perspective, also for...
Move the mic.
Yeah, also for this discussion and raise awareness of what are you doing with this African continental free trade areas and with Smart Africa.
Sorry, we can't really hear you well. If you could just, thank you.
It's important to speak about this idea, Smart Africa and continental free trade area, and in this context also about what we can do here for e-commerce and e-trade in Africa. One point is important and maybe a little bit provocative. You need products in Africa to trade. Every trade depends from goods and services, and of course we have a huge problem in Africa with productivity because of lack of infrastructure. You need skilled workers, but one driver beyond good governance and the framework is also access to big markets, interesting potential markets. And e-commerce is one of the, or e-trade is one of the instruments. You can use it to raise or to release the potential of this digitalization or new revolution with these new products in the digital world. And I think that is because of this new relationship between producers and sellers, and also it allows firms to come into the business from rural areas, from abroad, so that you can really you can give them access to markets across the globe and across latitude. We want to at the big market in Europe with the entire continent. And that is maybe something which could start with e-trade inside Africa, but also with full exit for every African country to the European market. And we are doing a lot of other things in Germany with strategic partnership for Digital Africa with German European companies. We have launched a Moving Rwanda initiative here with Volkswagen, VW, a German car maker, and SAP, the big software company, and others, to have a kind of integrated approach with car sharing, with production, or not car making, but the last step to set together the cars here in Rwanda, and also to give people a new a new access to mobility here in the country and in the neighboring countries, of course, in East Africa. So I think put it into a bigger or comprehensive picture.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Chris, you mentioned just some of the things that you've been learning. What is most exciting about CFTA in what you're trying to do?
I would say the most exciting thing I touched on a little bit, but is that, you know, our platform exists to match the big and the small. So a lot of our customers are working with large suppliers, and then they're selling to large customers. And when the transaction is sort of in that big realm, it's fairly easy. You know, the way things are done is well established, the way things are measured is normal, everyone's accepted sort of these standards. And then when it gets to the part of the transaction where the SME is executing, there's very little standardization around that. And that's true within a single country, but it's magnified as you move from one country to another. And so to have the free trade zone sort of normalizing that part of our transaction when a small business is importing goods and clearing customs and distributing them in their country.
The mobile and broadband penetration. Because, yes, some of the countries, we are at different scales of penetration. And some of the countries that are actually advanced in terms of mobile and broadband penetration, they have that opportunity to start debating about the changes of business to consumer. Unlike other countries that actually are falling far behind in terms of mobile and broadband penetration. So for me, ICT policy is very key, and the ICT policy of our respective countries has to be really enabling and looking at ICT tools as key enabler to facilitate trade and economic growth. So what we are doing in terms of improving business to consumer, yes, is trying to reduce the cost of ownership, the cost of penetration. What's the cost of the gadget? What is the cost of a mobile phone? What's the cost of a computer? So all these enablers have to be softened in terms of ownership to our citizens. Let them be able to access internet at affordable cost. Let them have the opportunity to be literate in that space in terms of digital literacy, but also the cost of ownership for you to have the last mile to the final consumer. So that requires a lot of effort from the government, but also the private sector. So what we are doing as a government, I think if you look at the tax policy of some of the African countries that actually have moved very fast in that area, is because they've reduced and softened the cost and the burden of owning these gadgets to facilitate the implementation of the policy. So we are trying to make sure that this time around, make it more or less cheap, close to zero in terms of the cost. Understand this is just an enabler. Money will come through other revenue streams in terms of taxation. The more the economy grows, the more tax you will collect. Don't look at this ICT infrastructure and ICT tools as a source of tax revenue. So that's what we are trying to do. Another key driver that we are trying to use is to actually encourage the consumers, incentivize them. Try to run promotions, but also consider at some point also having tax rebates. If you consume so much, this is what is needed for you. So we have a lot in store for our citizens in Africa, and I can assure you that in the next possibly couple of months, at least this time for Rwanda, there's a lot that's going to happen in that space, and we have the consumers this time as our enforcing agency to ensure that we change the culture and see the penetration really happening. Thank you.
So you're incentivizing the consumer to go cashless, essentially, and giving us a tax rebate. I think we should clap for that, right? I mean, I would love to get a tax rebate at the end of the year because I've gone digital. Do you think that is something that can actually catch on, that would that would inspire businesses to acquire those ICT tools that consumers are demanding for?
Like I did mention at the start, the business to business is happening. Adopted the technology, but the adoption level is still very low.
Okay.
So we are saying, what can we do to make it more or less mandatory, but without policing the business person?
Very good.
So we've gone as far as monitoring the full ecosystem of trade, right from import or manufacturing, for that matter, to final consumer.
Yes.
But there are gaps in between. So we are trying to say, let this be a citizen-driven initiative. Let everybody own this drive, because at the end of the day, this is your money that you're paying that comes back to you in other externalities. So that's what we're trying to do to ensure that penetration is happening automatically. But again, this will work for some economies, not for others, depending on your level of penetration and what ICT policy you've put in place.
Really interesting to hear some of these thoughts. Marco, I would be interested to know what, if any, consumer-driven incentives, like Richard is mentioning, have they contributed somewhere else? Is that something that you think we can maybe easily replicate across the continent to get us consumers to have power in driving digital trade?
Well, I'd say it is possible. However, I would like first to highlight one very important point which was raised by Mr. Richard.
Can you give me that?
Money is the consequence. Money is not objective by itself. Money is an outcome of work and trade. Therefore, yes, I'd say any action oriented towards increasing trade, towards increasing spending, is legitimate action. We can talk what are the best possible incentives to go cashless, but we cannot question if it motivates some. And why is it so important? Why is it so important for Rwanda? Why is it so important for entire Africa? It's not only about goods. Usually when we say trades, we think about goods. It's about goods and services. And I will give you one clear example where Rwanda can become a leader. Rwanda can become a leader in fintech and in supporting other countries in their process of digital transformation. Because Rwanda has capacities, certain human potential. With appropriate development, it can go up. It has vision, and it has know-how and in-house experiences of do's and don'ts. Most of other African countries do not have that experience, frankly speaking. But how, for example, a company operating in Rwanda can go to, let's say, Algeria, or let's take, I don't know, Chad, which is on very low level of digital transformation, to discuss and to support digitalization of Chad if you cannot align, if your trade license cannot be accepted in Chad? Very basic thing. What to say about transportation if we are talking about goods? What we found out, why harmonization within the European Union with all plus and minus things, which I had a chance to see, and Mr. Günther also had a chance to see, why harmonization brought benefit. Can you imagine the situation of having one truck moving from country A to country B? So you agreed everything on policy level, and everything is beautiful, and everything is fine. But small, simple regulation is not correct. You have either to buy new tires, and your product becomes not competitive on the market because it is too expensive, or to return your truck back, or to lease the truck and work forced to repack the truck from the second country. So very simple situation. And add to this what His Excellent President of Rwanda, Mr. Paul Kagame, rightly said this morning. Visas. We are talking about all these things. If move, not to relocate from country A to country B, not to relocate for life necessarily, but to move in order to foster exchange of goods and services. If there are never-ending procedures, where do we go? Then, March 21st, 2018, will be remembered in a history as historical effort of the people, but will not be remembered as success story. But if these things are taken into account, if experiences, especially experiences from European Union, do's and don'ts, are taken into account, and if it is properly recognized who can take over leadership roles in certain fields, as I said, entire Africa in it as described. Thank you.
Thank you.
So having all this in mind, I believe this can become a success story. March 21st, 2018 can become a success story, but there must be a will to change in depth, not on surface, in depth, systematic changes on multiple levels and as much harmonization as possible. Sorry for being a bit longer.
I mean, for sure, harmonization of major policies around logistics, around movement of people, etc., is really critical. And Alex, you mentioned that logistics is one of the hardest things to solve, particularly for SMEs. What are some of the things that you're doing? I'm sure what Richard and Marco had said is resonating, and Gunther had also had mentioned that they're doing a lot of work in driving e-trade, etc.
So the biggest challenges with logistics, especially in Africa, is that, especially when you are dealing with intra-African trade, is in our case anyway, where we are doing B2C, you just don't have enough volumes for the prices to go down. So you have to have a very efficient platform, that collects different, goods at the same time, so that you can put them in one truck. Now, as Marco said, the other, of course, challenge that is still present in African countries is that in most cases, you can't use the same sort of truck or logistic company to go to another country. You either need to use international couriers, which are very expensive, for even transporting to Kenya, where you can use a truck, because most of these things are treated as if it's more, 20th century B2B. So I think there needs to be, maybe policy around e-commerce, where it's more like smaller, high-frequency goods, more than using the same regulations for somebody who is importing sugar or cement or, those in bulk, which would help us in the sense that, the taxes will be smaller, and we can even use a company in Rwanda and can go all the way to Kenya to transport a phone or a computer. So it's been a challenge. What we've been trying to do, obviously, is to work with international, logistic companies and to, optimize our platform as much as possible. Bring down the cost a little bit. Harmonization, as Marco says, where there is concerted effort to make proper not just free trade of free movement of goods, but also think about how you tax logistic companies. Think about how you tax small shipments. Don't always think that these are people are trying to do business and tax them too much. Those kind of things will also help to do export digitally.
Thank you. I want to bring in Dr. Homogene Zengimana, particularly around Marco has mentioned a lot about harmonization, and standards are crucial. It pains me to go to a supermarket and find a lot of imported options, including basics like toothpicks and milk that we have in plenty here. What do we have to do to have, harmonized standards that will bring value addition to our goods and services in such a way that we can demand and consume them and also be able to meaningfully contribute to our development through export?
Thank you very much for the floor. Let me start by maybe saying that trade itself is not fair. That's where everything should start. We should understand that trade is not a fair game. You should know the regulations, know the rules of the game. If you don't know the rules of the game, we will not trade, even if we have the CFTA. Let's start by knowing that. In 1977, our head of state put on African Organization for Standardization. They requested us to harmonize standards, harmonize evaluation of conformity, harmonize technical regulations. 1977. Today, we only have 37 members of African Organization for Standards. We can't trade in 56 countries if we can't harmonize, because standards do three things, the three C's. One C is compete. The second C is conform. We compete. To come to your question, we should not ignore our products. Let's look at our SMEs. We have model we call maturity model. The maturity model is what India uses, helped by the Quality Council, where SMEs are improving to go to the value chain, regional value chain, from bronze level, silver level, gold, and platinum. But look what is happening in our countries. You have a chocolate in Ghana, you don't want to buy that chocolate, you want a Swiss chocolate. You have good textile materials, but if you are not dressed in Italian suit, you don't want to buy our local products. We will not move if we don't go through the maturity models to come from bronze to platinum. If an industry is not conforming, like what Marco said, aflatoxin level, why can't you help it? But we can't help also the SMEs if the quality infrastructure, what we call soft infrastructure, is not developed. Quality infrastructure, we did a stock taking on the continent in 2014 and 2017. Only 4 countries are able to trade in a quality way in Africa: South Africa, Kenya, Tunisia, and Egypt. Because Marco said about the tires, if you don't have a laboratory to test those tires, what you usually do, you refuse. You just refuse because you don't want an accident to happen at the end of the day. What are countries doing to overcome what is called NTBs, non-tariff barriers? That is key. It's not about having goods only. Negotiation between the European Union and the USA on free trade agreement has not yet finished. Kitui might say about it. Has not yet finished due to issue of standards. Then you go to second C, conform. When we want to conform, there is a principle we call 1-1-1 principle. One standard, one test, one certificate. Meaning a product should come from South Africa and reach Egypt. That they did the test, they have a certificate, and you go. If you can't grow that quality infrastructure, the 1-1-1 principle will never happen. Then connect, the third C. That's where we need actually a think tank that Smart Africa should think about it. We need a think tank that analyze these agreements we sign, link to what we trade, not excluding the private sector, because it's very key. We need traceability of our goods, because we are saying intra-Africa trade, but it's not only that. We are opening up a market, Gans said it, European EPA, AGOA discussion, a product coming to Gambia because of free trade will reach Rwanda because we have opened up our border. How can we have tools, digital tools, to trace that product and trace the safety of that product? It's very important, otherwise we will be again a market of counterfeit product. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Omojen. I see Dr. Kitui has joined us. I would like to invite you to make your intervention. UNCTAD works to connect world economies together. So it would be interesting to hear what, in light of the Continental Free Trade Area, what you're going to be doing to drive that intra-Africa trade.
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity. First of all, I'll do two components. One, just trade as such, but also digital economy, e-commerce. First of all, I have been associated with the Continental Free Trade negotiations for a long time. And one of the main challenges that we face is after surmounting the political hurdle of nations buying into the project, we have to deal with the physical challenge of a colonial infrastructure which connects our mines and our fields to the ports. The export infrastructure for extractives. You can now electronically buy something from Cameroon when you're in Rwanda, but if it has got to come to you via South Africa, the cost of transporting and the time it takes away, tempts the spirit of African economic engagement. So the massive infrastructure in a connective, integrative infrastructure is going to be important. The third thing, we have learned the hard way that the ability to trade does not just mean the ability to import. And therefore, we have to start saying that pari passu to building infrastructure for trade and trade facilitation, we must grow Africa's capacity to produce something to trade. The volume of what Africa sells to itself and what Africa sells to the rest of the world is so important that with the free trade agreement in Africa, it's easier for others to sell to Africa than before you signed the CFTA. Having said that, I want to just say a few things relating to the digital economy. Unfortunately, at a time when we're realizing the critical importance and the growing centrality of the electronic marketplace, globally, the resources availed to development, the component of ICT as a percentage of aid for trade, for example, from the development partners, has declined from 3% to 1% over the last 10 years. And similarly, multilateral lending institutions, the share of investments and loans into ICT-related enterprises stands at 1%. So it's an acute shortage of resourcing for building the infrastructure, the content, the skill set, the regulation, the regulatory framework, interoperability, and so on, that are critically important for electronic commerce. So what are we doing? A number of things. First of all, we are assisting countries, and we're pushing. My message to Broadband Commission this morning was, can we mobilize to have a few more Kagames around Africa? Presidents will see that if you have no electronic market visibility, you are not existent. Second, can we engage partners, international development institutions, international multilateral agencies, to think smart in new ways of dealing with the challenges of the digital exclusion of Africa? One area is diagnostic studies of where you are. You cannot treat your sickness if you don't know it. And I'm very glad that we get substantial support from the German government, for example, in a new initiative I started last year of e-preparedness. How is the state of play in your country? And with German support, we are doing a study of Zambia, Uganda, Togo, Senegal, Madagascar, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. I've already finished the all LDCs of Asia. And we think that this is an important way to go. Let us find smart partnerships answering to the questions of what are the gaps, what is necessary to invest to close those gaps. A third area to go, start looking for new partnerships. 2 months ago, we launched a study we've just completed, the ICT State of Play and National E-Commerce Strategy for Egypt, funded by MasterCard. There is a lot of private sector players who are available, if properly brought into partnership, to contribute in closing the gap of financing, building and enabling an ecosystem for the growth of e-commerce for Africa. And finally, we must continue mobilizing Africa, push their governments to move in the direction that they need to be electronically visible in the marketplace. I was glad that last year in this city, Friday, young net entrepreneurs from Africa to go for this course in China. I hope that others can help to build this ecosystem, because these are the ones who are going to drive governments to look where they're not looking sufficiently. Thank you.
Chairperson of International Commission on Cybersecurity Law. Listening to the panelists, clearly different strategies. In the context of regulatory and legal frameworks for digital trade, I wanted to hear the view of the panelists as to whether the time has not come for Africa to start instantaneously thinking of the three musketeers, whether it's blockchains, whether it's artificial intelligence, or whether it's the Internet of Things. Should we not look in the direction like what Belarus has certainly done? The Republic of Belarus has, in the last few months, come up with a new legislation that's not just granted legality to blockchains, but has also granted legal frameworks for crypto mining. So in a scenario like this, I thought it will be a good idea if Africa could start adopting more futuristic provisions in terms of regulatory frameworks. I'm particularly interested in blockchains, because while blockchain does come across with large number of legal, policy, and regulatory issues, but the fact still remains is blockchain is the next big game changer. And if we can start providing enabling legal frameworks for blockchains, that can actually transform Africa from its current state onto the leading cusp of technological development. The thoughts of the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned blockchain. It's one of the main focuses of this Transform Africa Summit. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot more in the next couple of days about that. But I'll have the panelists come back. There's a lady, yes. And then
Thank you, Lucy. Mine is not a question, but just some sharing of experiences of what we've learned in digitalizing trade in our work. I'm the country director of Trademark East Africa in Rwanda, and we are an Aid for Trade organization in all the East African countries. We've done a lot of work. Our work is multifaceted. We have a number of thematic areas in infrastructure, in standards and NTBs. I had the doctor speaking very passionately about standards. But what we've learned in digitalizing trade is you have to approach it in such a way that it covers both the government services and the private sector. Very clearly on services are reaching those who need them timely, so that the services are, or the trade is more efficiently done.
Thank you.
What, the next thing is making sure that those digital services that have so one of the things that we've learned is that it's very important to engage both nationally, regionally, but also on a continental level if you're going to get the results. I think one of the areas where we've registered really good results in partnership with the government of Rwanda specifically is the electronic single window, where every year studies have shown that the businesses are actually having savings of about $11 million, just because now they're able to go to a one-stop shop to get all their trade-related services. The other area, am I overshooting my time?
Go ahead.
Okay, just one other area is on the need for crowd platforms for the private sector, other the smaller, cross-border traders that are benefiting from this digital trade.
Thank you, Patience. Those two questions and interventions are loaded, so I'll come back, Richard. I would really love to hear what you have to say. And would you, one moment? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just in 2 sentences. First, regarding the example of Belarus. As a citizen of Serbia who is living in Dubai and managing development of global university, I am very well aware of recent legislative activities in Belarus. I'd say you are never, ever, you can never say that your field for online business is over-regulated. You can regulate, you regulate. The point is, I believe it is a good move, and I believe, as I mentioned already, digital transformation is very important. Consequently, legislation supporting quick digital transformation is a must, but it should also be done in careful, competent, to avoid scam, to avoid fraudulent activities, and very important thing for the entire Africa is to return back good and positive reputation, which was very strongly jeopardized by activities of some countries. It's not my job to name them, but you know what I'm talking about when it comes to online security and safety. That's why I pointed out example of Rwanda as example of good practice and as a leading model for other countries. I agree with full heart that those things are good and useful.
All right.
Thanks.
Dr. Gunther, and then we'll come to Richard.
Yes, I would like to answer the question regarding blockchain. I think that could really be a game changer, much more than e-trade or e-commerce, because of this is a totally new algorithm to make institutions not necessary. The coins or the currency without a bank, but also, and that is much more important for the development community or for developing countries, you do not need a land register in a cadastre office. You do not need to register the persons. The big institution, you can do it with the smartphones. And only the protocols, the blockchain, by every actor, give you a kind of, that is absolutely sure, and you cannot be corrupt or can neglect anything what has happened in this different blockchain activities. And the problem sometimes is we are starting with the most complex issues, and the German development to African countries called True Budget, and that is only to use blockchain in parallel to a normal procurement process to make sure that there is very clear where the money has gone, and that is no corruption and no, that could change a lot and that could make many programs and projects in the development activities much more cheaper and more efficient and with much more impact and maybe also faster. And so I'm very convinced of such a new technology, blockchain, but maybe we have to discuss which kind of steps we are going together, and maybe it's more an experimental approach. It's not to speak in the first step about the regulatory framework. We will need it, but maybe we have to develop this by implementation and doing this, and not to thinking about this, and maybe are much more sophisticated than those normal processes we registering persons, registering land cadastre, or have a kind of very clear and transparent process of procurement and using for this blockchain. And in Berlin we have a vital scenery of startups, and also blockchain is one of the most important things also for big companies. They're all trying to do something with this new technology. And for me, it's also a game changer for the ministries. We are all dealing with development issues and money from taxpayers, and that's very important.
So we'll have a lot of time to delve into blockchain, I believe, tomorrow and Wednesday. Richard, I think you can respond to some of what patients raised, particularly around government. As we wind this down, I'll just have one more question, but if you could talk about the ensuring government services are digitized and easy to access and be paid for by particularly the small traders near the borders, etc. I think that would be helpful.
Well, I think the solutions that have been put forward in terms of e-government are mainly targeting the low end, the small traders. So the single window that did mention about is a system that actually all the traders are using, be it small or large traders. But what it does is just trying to reduce the burden of compliance. But also, from policy perspective, we've also implemented what we call cross-border trade facilitation, where you can transact a nominal amount that we don't, if you exceed, say, $1,000, then you can start getting into the rigorous custom procedures. So all that is trying to encourage the small traders to be able to grow and trade at a lower transaction cost. So we are partnering with the development partners. We are working with private sector. All the interventions that we are making are demand-driven because they are coming from the demands of the private sector, irrespective of the size. But again, as you try to embrace all these changes, it is also a call for private sector to embrace those changes. In some cases, the government really moves very fast to have these initiatives put in place, and the private sector is not embracing them. So it requires a lot of education, sensitization, to ensure that actually whatever we put in place is embraced, and hence the economic benefits will trickle to the final consumer within our society.
Thank you, Richard. Final question and intervention. Okay, so I will take the first two gentlemen and then end with you, Dr. Kitui. Please, if you could stand up, please, so they can see and give you the mic. And then the gentleman in the front and Dr. Kitui to end. Thanks. Please keep it as short as possible. I want to make sure you're looking beautiful and handsome for the culture soirée.
Merci. Bonjour, je m'appelle Yacouba Sissé. Je viens de la Guinée. Je suis le directeur de télécom au ministère. Moi, je voudrais juste poser la question aux panélistes. Au fait, on a expliqué le matin qu'il faut, pour développer le marché numérique africain, il faut d'abord poser les bases d'infrastructures. Mais aujourd'hui, moi j'ai l'inquiétude du fait que l'Afrique aujourd'hui, il y a un problème de développement du contenu. Pour développer le marché, aujourd'hui, l'Afrique n'a pas encore comment faire le renforcement pour que nous ayons un marché commun africain. Donc, qu'est-ce que l'organisation a prévu pour ce renforcement des capacités des Africains? Merci.
Thank you. And the organization, you mean Smart for Africa, right? Go ahead. Please.
Thank you. My name is Francisco Koboko from Botswana, an entrepreneur. I understand that we are saying that we need to digitize across Africa. But one of the key ingredients of us being able to digitize uniformly is us having uniform education across the African divide. I think one of the things that is true for my country, which is also probably true for other many African countries, is that one, our curriculums are very old. Some are 70 years old, and nothing has been done to change them. They've only been tweaked. But we also know that the requirements for a knowledge economy model and a digital economy revolution that we so much need will need new skill sets that will allow all Africans to be able to take place and to drive this new revolution themselves. So how are we going to do that without necessarily also driving for us to have maybe not a single curriculum across the whole of Africa, but to have uniform education curriculums from basic education level. The second point is maybe it's about time we have a repository for all these great innovations that are being spoken about here, such that each and every child, even those sitting in the dark corners of Africa, when they've got access to ICT, they should be able to access this information and help us drive the change that we want to see. Thank you.
All right, so the two questions are related, capacity building and access to technology. Dr. Kitui, and then we can, as we're giving your closing remarks, speak to capacity, some of the things that you're doing to build capacity.
Thank you. My remarks are related to what the gracious lady from Trademark East Africa raised.
Okay.
It is true that one of the main challenges is thinking beyond e-commerce and think about the digital economy. And that includes e-government, facilitating transactions efficiently and cost-effectively. And I thank very much Trademark East Africa. They have been our main financial supporters in single window development in Rwanda and Uganda, which are underway. But I wanted to mention something which is important. You can have the technical ability to improve on efficiency, but if you don't have the political will to fight the patrons, the beneficiaries of a parasite inefficient system, you management, Asikuda. When we installed it in DRC, the customs revenue went up 400%. You see how much was leaking. Now, recently, we started installing it in another country. But very powerful people in government who have been responsible for the leakage in public revenue collection started pushing back because this efficiency takes away the holy cow. And so you have to be facing the challenge of real pushback from the lords of poverty. And finally, the most important challenge to Africa's trade integration is not technical, it's political. Those of you from this African community, we tell you, in my earlier life, I spent 24 hours sitting at Gatuna crossing point between Rwanda and Uganda, where you'll find a customs officer opening a basket of biscuits to try to verify that there's nothing else being smuggled in that packet of biscuits. You know, the ad minimis rule, where you say small things we can ignore inspection, comes with goodwill. In many countries in Africa with a common market, you find officers at the border who will tell you, we have not been told about that regulation. So ignorance is a major non-tariff trade barrier.
Right.
And it's usually a political barrier. So energizing a collective commitment between governments, civil society players, academia, and partners to have the political will to move forward, like the unilateral decision of Rwanda to say Africans don't need visas to come to Rwanda, is a statement in the right direction that goes beyond technical possibilities.
Thank you, Victor. So it seems to me, and I completely understand, leadership is the driver of everything, and political will can remove those excuses at the border that I don't know about that regulation. Give your closing remarks. Please respond to the question of capacity building, as well as anything else. I will start with you, Mr. Gunther.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I have mentioned several programs from the German Development Ministry and German government, and I would like to say there's also what World Economic Forum, we agreed with Rwanda and the former minister for ITC.
We can't hear.
Yes.
I don't know if you're able to just speak.
But it's e-commerce with a big German company, DHL, the logistic company, to bring products from Rwanda to Germany, to Europe, as an e-commerce program. And what I have to say is we all on the government side, on the private actors, we need too much time for being successful in establishing, implementing what we have agreed already. And many other programs. We're supporting the CFTA by a program with the German Federal Organization for Standardization. I have negotiated this in our bilateral cooperation with the African Union, for instance. We have a lot of vocational training and e-learning programs where capacity building is one of the main component. I mentioned the blockchain program of the KfW, and also you have mentioned the so-called e-trade readiness assessments. We made what is possible and what not. Another issue from the private sector, code weeks, for instance, conducted by SAP, the software company from Germany, and also what I mentioned with Moving Rwanda. That is a bigger program. VW, Siemens, Lagna, 3-4 big German companies want together create manufacturing or car production in Rwanda, but also car sharing and a new smart city project for the to be here in the country, here in Kigali, successful with an approach which hasn't happened anywhere else. So it's very interesting also for big German or European cooperatives to make to have connections or linkages to those in the developing countries who are able to be responsible for the last mile and for bringing cars into the IT environment here in the city. So it's the program called Make IT, where we are also very successful in different African countries. And it's not about capacity building and as lecturing in the hotel. It's more about capacity building and doing on the job, learning entrepreneurship when they can work together with big German or international companies.
Thank you. Grace?
Thank you. So our users, the users on our platform that have our mobile application installed, are beginning to develop into sets of clusters around specific sectors. So in healthcare and ICT, our group of users, specifically here in Rwanda, are becoming one of the larger buying groups in the country. So we're buying lots of goods in ICT and lots of goods in healthcare. And as a result, we are developing a curriculum to invest in educating them to become better traders. And we've invested in things like how to source better, how to think about how currency impacts, the life of your trade when you're working inside of a framework contract, and the Rwandan franc versus the dollar or the euro is going to change your pricing. And so we've been able to really focus on building that curriculum and deploying it through the platform at the sort of outer ends of the trade transaction where things were uniform. And the thing that I think is really exciting about this moment in history and sort of what's in the near-term future is we can start to develop a curriculum on educating our users on that middle section, on sort of these new synergies and efficiencies that will come out of a lot of this harmonization. And so we're excited to invest in that and sort of help build the capacity of our users to make them better at what they do.
Good. Alex.
So for us, in terms of capacity building, we're looking at it from two angles. So we have, obviously, our employees of DMMHehe who we try as much as possible to bring in people from Japan to come in and, help out in areas which are missing. At the same time, we also have programs where we have our engineers of Hehe training, people from K-Lab, from these other, or students of universities, or interning, have them interning in our company, because we understand that that's the key, for having, a future workforce. At the same time, we also have, our users, obviously, most of them it's the first time to use an online platform. Our SMEs online, so we have sessions at our office where they come in and we train them from the beginning on how to manage these things. So those are the two key things. And maybe to just highlight one point that I didn't mention regarding not harmonizing, regarding not just thinking of free movement of goods and services, but harmonizing. One thing that I think is important is payments. So one challenge we're having right now is there's not many people in many African countries who, have credit cards, but that's the only form of payment if you want to buy cross-border. So, like if mobile money, for instance, or other forms of payments could be streamlined, and the regulation regarding that could be made better so that we have the same networks. We have Airtel, MTN. So if you are able, let's say, to use your MTN mobile money account here to buy something in Kenya, or somebody in Kenya doing the same, that's also critical, I feel, for digitally doing trade for Africa.
I'll make a shameless plug for EcoBank. We can solve that problem for you, at least in the countries that we work. Marco.
Well, as I'm representing an academic institution, it's our job to deal with capacity building and with curriculum development. As per capacity building, I would try to say the point in one sentence. We have 4 campuses in Dubai, Mumbai, Singapore, Sydney. And we are doing executive education, training, and capacity building programs in more than 40 countries. What we found out, you need to localize. You cannot copy program from Germany, for example, and paste it in Botswana and expect it to work perfectly.
Yes.
No way. Or vice versa. If something works very well in Botswana, probably there is high probability it will not work, for example, in Croatia. So, localize is keyword for capacity building. For educational systems and alignment, again in one sentence, our point of view. We are facing with students from different parts of the world. One alumni is sitting here in this hall. One, yes. Our point, when we see people from diverse countries, we are global. We are top 20 in the world. People are coming to us. What we saw, make common learning outcomes, common outputs. Learning style might be free, but skill set should be as unified as possible. If you want people to be competitive on the global market, then their skill set should be comparable. And then you do the needful within the system. So skill set, I agree with your point about need to innovate curricula. We will try our best in discussion with RDB and other institutions also to be present as SPJ here in the region and in Rwanda in particular. But it's not for announcement yet. However, the point is make outcomes standard request from the people. That will make people employable, and that will make school system to adapt, because if they do not adapt, they will lose enrollment of students. And in public sector especially, they depend in most countries on the enrollment. More students you have, more money you take. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. I think on capacity building, one, we need to leverage on visionary leadership. I try to speak again for Rwanda, where through our President Paul Kagame, he managed to get the centers of excellence in science and mathematics, specifically CMU and AIMS. Now, we have those two campuses here in Rwanda, trying to really teach the African top brains in those disciplines. So what we are doing to leverage on that is to make sure that as a government, some of the government agencies and even private sector to a great extent, we try to make sure that we use those students when they are even still at school. So they are trying to solve real life problems so that by the time they get on the job market, they have the expertise. And the challenge that we have on that particular initiative is how to make use of these young, brilliant MU's kids, because most of them are young, who are ready, they have the appetite really to innovate, transform, and make an impact on our societies, but also more importantly, to retain them within Africa. So I want to call on all the stakeholders, government and private sector, to ensure that we use those students to the maximum and make sure that we really pay them competitively to stay within our economies. As they stay in our economy, they will pass on the knowledge to the young ones who are coming through the graduation schemes of the data science, the mathematics. And then by doing that, we can have the capacity that we need to drive the transformation that we desire within Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think some of the things that the recurring themes are harmonization. Will be critical for us to achieve digital trade. Harmonization, I'm sure, applies to education, to skills development, policies about tires, etc. So I think one of the things that we will need to track by next year is harmonization. But to make it all work, to Dr. Kitui's point, is political will. And political will is not just, obviously, government, but it's every one of us that is in a position of leadership to make life as easy as possible for those that we serve. So thank you all for your contributions. Thank you for those who've stuck with us. I wish you all a fantastic evening and a great Transform Africa Summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy and her panel. I've been advised to request that the Honorable Jean-Philbert Nsengimana gives us a few words about what's to come next, right after here. Honorable.
Good evening. Honorable Ministers, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. At the end of this first and productive day, the last thing I'd like to do is to serve you with another speech. So I will do only 3 things here. Number 1, I'd like to thank you, not just for coming, but for staying up until the end. I think you can give yourself a round of applause. Number two, I'd like to share just a few things that I learned today. From His Excellency the President in the morning, I learned that integration means that Africa's traffic, whether voice or data, doesn't have to pay a ticket or apply for a visa for us as Africans to speak to each other. He invited us to think harder to solve this problem, and he gave us that challenge to go back with. From Strive Masiyiwa, I learned that we should not expect leadership only from the public sector, that the private sector also has leaders and they have a shared responsibility to drive Africa's digital transformation. And he said that the fact that we have the Continental Free Trade Area is the best thing that would have happened to our private sector, but to our people more generally, ever since independence. From Dr. Hamadoun Touré, I heard that the job of leaders is to dream, and to dream big, and then to share those dreams so that they become a vision. And the job of the rest of us is to execute on those vision, turning them into missions and execute them to produce results. As I sat into this audience, I heard many P's being pronounced. I heard about politics and leadership. I heard about policies which need to be conducive. I heard about programs and products which are necessary to translate those policies into actions. I heard about partnerships without which nothing can be achieved. But I also heard about platforms, specifically technology platforms that we need to have in place to drive the Continental Free Trade Area fast forward. I heard about connectivity platforms. That was the first panel. Leaving no one behind, connecting everyone. I heard about financial inclusion platforms based on mobile, but also recently based on blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies, and so on, that we should leverage those platforms to make payments faster, safer, and more affordable across the continent. And again, that our money in Africa doesn't to pay a visa. I'm not against Visa or MasterCard or any brand, but our money doesn't to pay a ticket and a visa to reach one another, especially when we are transacting in our continent. I heard about trading platforms. That was about this last panel. How technology can make trade more seamless, can improve logistics, can allow us to maintain and improve our quality assurance mechanisms, eliminate non-trade barriers, but also put in place a good infrastructure to facilitate e-commerce in our continent. The last thing, I've been asked to do a call of action, and I will do it in 4 T's. Connect, educate, promote, regulate, protect, invest, innovate, and quit. Quit. I heard people saying, government, once you have done that, you put in place policies, you've put in place a good regulation, then you should take a back seat and let the private sector take the driving seat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Honorable Jean-Philbert Nsengimana. Only him can hype up a crowd like this, right? He damn near broke into a rap medley there. The rhymes were coming off. All right. I think it's time to have fun. What do you guys say? Time to have fun? All right. So I don't hear. Time to have fun? Come on. All right. So moving from here, I suggest you guys have a little tea, a little coffee in the meantime. Buses will start picking you up at 6 p.m. here, taking you to the Kigali exhibition village, which is in town. So please, for those who can remain here. The buses will be picking you up. And then go to the cultural soiree. We'll all be there. It will be amazing. wear your best attire, your best African attire if you have one, and let's enjoy ourselves. This has been an amazing day. My name is Regis Isheja. It's been a pleasure to be an MC. Have a great day.
muhango rero cyangwa se umunsi wa mbere w'inama ya Transform Africa akaba rero uhumuje aho n'ikiganiro cya kabiri cyagiteganyijwe nyuma ya saa sita nacyo gisoje aho bareberaga hamwe ubucuruzi muri Afurika ukuntu bushobora gukorwa hakoreshejwe cyangwa se hifashishijwe ikoranabuhanga. Ikiganiro kinini kandi cyiza cyagaragayemo impande zitandukanye zifite naho zihuriye n'amafaranga ndetse n'ibijyanye n'imisoro n'amahoro uburyo ki ubucuruzi bwo kuramutse bushyizwe hamwe aricyo byabyara. Ibi bagiye babisanisha cyangwa se bigaruka cyane cyane ku bijyanye n'iri soko rusange rya Afurika ko riramutse